Hey there, welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're going on a little time travel journey through some of the most miserable moments in human history. Yeah, it turns out things could always be worse. Much worse. From years where the sun vanished, to pandemics with no medicine, to centuries of backbreaking labour, this video explores what it was really like to live through the absolute worst times to be human. So grab a cosy blanket, maybe some tea, and get ready for some historical misery. Told nice and gently, of course. And hey, if you truly enjoy the videos I make, feel free to like and subscribe. No pressure. Only if it genuinely brings you some peace, perspective, or maybe just helps you fall asleep to the sound of ancient suffering. Alright, let's begin. So, let's be honest. Being human is already kinda hard. Bills, back pain, awkward texts. Modern life is no walk in the park, but if you've ever muttered, "I was born in the wrong era," you might want to hold that thought, because as it turns out, most other eras were absolutely brutal. Like, lose 3 teeth before lunch. Brutal. Tonight we're going to take a calm little stroll through some of the most miserable, unlucky, and just plain awful moments in human history. Think of it as the suffering Olympics, but instead of medals, you get fleas, famine, and a strong case of existential dread. Let's set the mood. You're lying in bed, lights low, you're warm, safe, maybe even a little bored, but now imagine waking up in the year 536, where the sun doesn't rise properly for over a year. Or maybe you're a medieval farmer, and your dinner is turnips again, unless the plague eats your entire village first. Comforting, right? That's the vibe we're going for. Now, I'm not saying humans have had it easy lately. The last few decades have definitely delivered their share of headaches. But compared to some of the stuff we're about to explore, your Wi-Fi cutting out doesn't even register. We're talking volcanic winters, world-ending plagues, collapsing civilizations, and centuries where your biggest accomplishment was, didn't die before 30. The idea for this video came from wondering, when exactly was the worst time to be a human? Historians actually debate this. Some say it was that gloomy, ash-covered year in the 500s. Others point to the horrors of the Black Death, or even the grinding misery of industrial life in the 1800s. But here's the twist. It wasn't just one moment, it was many, spread out like history's greatest hits of misery. And tonight we're going to lie back, get comfy, and walk through each one. Nice and easy. And don't worry, this isn't going to be a harsh history lesson. There's no pop quiz at the end. I'll keep the facts real but the tone soft. If you fall asleep somewhere between ancient volcanoes and Victorian coal mines, that's okay. That's kind of the goal. But before we go forward, let's do a little gratitude check. You've probably got access to clean water, indoor plumbing, and antibiotics. That puts you ahead of about 90% of history's humans already. You can take a hot shower, watch cat videos, or eat fruit in winter. Meanwhile, there were entire centuries where just surviving winter was a full-time job, and that job paid in frostbite. So as we dive into this historical roller coaster of doom, keep that perspective in mind. We're not here to make you sad, just curious. Maybe a little amazed at what humans have endured. Maybe a little thankful you weren't born in, say, a 13th century rat-infested sewer town. Because, spoiler alert, some people were, and it wasn't great. Now, if you find yourself actually enjoying this kind of thing, these slow, sleepy dives into history's darker corners, feel free to like and subscribe. Only if you really enjoy it, though. I don't do guilt trips, just stories. And honestly, knowing people out there find this relaxing is what keeps me going. Well, that and the fact that I don't have to wake up and hunt a mammoth tomorrow. Alright, ready? Blanket tucked in? Good. Let's travel back to what many historians call the single worst year to be alive. 536 DTI, a year where the sky went dark, crops failed, and people started wondering if the end of the world had quietly begun. Let's go. Alright, picture this. It's the year 536. You wake up one morning, step outside your wooden hut and the sun's gone. Not completely, but it's definitely not acting like itself. Instead of a warm sunrise, the sky is just a dull grey haze, like someone dimmed the lights on planet Earth. And it stays that way. For months. No bright blue skies, no summer warmth. Just this cold, eerie twilight that never really lifts. People start whispering that the gods are angry. others think it's the end of days, and honestly, it kinda feels like it. This wasn't just a gloomy week of bad weather, this was a year and a half of freaky sky darkness across Europe, the Middle East and parts of Asia. Trees didn't bloom, crops barely grew, temperatures dropped, snow fell in the middle of summer. People were confused, hungry and terrified. And back then they didn't have the Weather Channel to explain it all. They just knew something was very wrong. We now believe the cause was a massive volcanic eruption, maybe in Iceland, maybe somewhere in the tropics, that launched so much ash and debris into the upper atmosphere that it blocked out the sun. It created what scientists call a volcanic winter. Sounds dramatic, right? But that's exactly what happened. Global temperatures dropped by as much as 3 degrees Celsius. That may not sound like much, but to farmers in the 6th century, it was a death sentence. Crops failed, livestock died, people starved. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave off light without brightness like the moon. And he wasn't being poetic. That was how the sky actually looked. Another writer from Syria noted that there was a great and terrible sign in the heavens, and that crops withered in the fields. In China, summer snow fell, and famines swept the land. It wasn't just a bad year, it was global. And unfortunately, it wasn't a one-time punch. This volcanic chaos seems to have triggered a chain reaction. In 541, just a few years later, the world got hit with something even worse, the plague of Justinian, one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. And it happened while people were still reeling from years of darkness and starvation. So basically, the mid-500s were nature's way of saying, you thought that was bad, hold my beer. Let's zoom in a bit. Imagine being a regular person in 536. You've got a small field, maybe a few goats, and you rely on the seasons to feed your family. You don't have a weather app. You don't even know what a volcano is. One day the sun stops rising like normal. The days are dim and cold, even in summer. Your barley doesn't grow. Your kids are coughing. The village well is running dry and rumours are flying. People say the world is cursed. Maybe it's your fault. Maybe it's everyone's. Religious panic kicks in. Some blame demons. Others say it's punishment from the heavens. People start fasting, praying, burning incense, doing anything to make the sky turn blue again. But it doesn't. And as the months go by, desperation sets in. You see neighbours collapse from hunger. You start to ration your food, skipping meals. Eventually there's nothing left to ration. You eat bark, maybe even worse. And even when the skies do start to clear, it's not over. The economy crashes, trade routes fall apart. Empires like the Eastern Roman, Byzantine Empire are hit hard. Cities shrink. People flee. The social fabric begins to unravel. It's not the end of the world, but it sure feels close. What makes this all especially haunting is how little the people of the time understood what was happening. To us, it's a volcanic winter. To them, it was a sky curse, an apocalypse. Maybe the gods went away, or the sun was dying. They couldn't Google anything. They just endured, one cold grey day at a time. And it's not just modern scientists saying this was the worst year ever. Harvard medieval historian Michael McCormick once flat out said, "It was the beginning of one of the worst periods to be alive, if not the worst year." When a historian doesn't hedge their bets like that, you know it was serious. So, to recap, the sun disappears. Crops fail. Snow falls in June. People starve, and then a few years later, a pandemic kills millions. Welcome to the 530s. A time when the Earth itself seemed angry and humanity could do nothing but try to survive it. You didn't choose the volcanic winter life. It chose you. Now here's the kicker. We didn't even figure out the cause of this global disaster until recently. It wasn't until ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica showed a layer of volcanic ash dated to exactly 536 that scientists connected the dots. That mystery haze. Yeah, it was nature's ash cloud blanket. Comforting, right? So the next time the power goes out or your coffee machine breaks, just remember, at least the sky isn't permanently grey and snowing in July. You're already doing better than most of 536 did. You're warm, you're fed, and the sun still shows up on time. Alright, deep breath. Let's slowly step forward now into another human horror show. The next chapter, it's a real crowd thinner. We're talking about the Black Death, a time when rats ruled and survival meant dodging invisible death in every street and sneeze. Okay, so you survived 536. Congrats, you made it through the volcanic gloom, the freezing crops, and the famine. That alone deserves a round of applause. But now let's fast forward to a slightly less ash-covered, but no less terrifying time in human history. Europe around the year 1347. You're in a small village. Maybe you're a baker, or a farmer, or a monk who just likes copying books in peace. Life is simple. A little rough, sure, but manageable. Until one day people in town start getting sick. And not like, ugh, I have a cold sick. We're talking full body boils, fevers, and a very high chance of dying within a few days. Welcome to the Black Death. The plague rolls into Europe on ships coming from the east, likely through trade routes from the Black Sea. On board, rats, and on those rats, fleas. And inside those fleas, a microscopic horror known as Yersinia pestis, a bacteria that doesn't mess around. It spreads fast, first in ports, then in cities, then to towns, and finally to even the most remote farmhouses. Within just a few years, it kills off an estimated 25 to 50 million people in Europe alone, about 1/3 to half the population. That's like snapping your fingers and watching every second person vanish. It's hard to describe just how terrifying this was. You could be healthy one day and dead by the next. The plague had multiple forms. Bubonic, the one with the swollen black lumps under your skin. Septicemic, it gets in your blood. Very bad. And pneumonic, in your lungs. Very, very contagious. There was no understanding of germs, no antibiotics, no idea where it came from or how to stop it. People just knew that death was everywhere, and it moved fast. Imagine the panic. Streets full of bodies, priests overwhelmed with last rites, gravediggers dropping like flies, entire towns depopulated in weeks. If you were lucky enough to survive, you might return to your village only to find it completely empty. Doors swinging open, food rotting, silence. And you'd have no idea who was next. People tried everything to protect themselves. Some locked themselves indoors. Others fled the cities for the countryside, not knowing they were just carrying the plague with them. Some whipped themselves in public, believing that punishing their sinful flesh would make God spare them. Others turned on scapegoats, accusing the poor, outsiders, or entire communities of causing the disease. In some places, violence broke out. Humanity didn't just suffer physically, it broke emotionally and morally too. One of the creepiest details is the appearance of the so-called plague doctors. You've probably seen them. Long cloaks, leather gloves, and that iconic beaked mask. The beak was stuffed with herbs and spices, meant to purify the air. These doctors weren't necessarily trained professionals. In fact, a lot of them were just whoever was brave or desperate enough to walk into infected zones. But they became symbols of the era. Death. Walking. Let's talk about daily life for a moment. You wake up in your one-room home. There's a weird smell in the air. Burning incense, maybe. Or just decay. Someone down the road is screaming. You hear the church bell toll again. It's been ringing constantly for days. You try to keep your head down. Maybe you boil some water, maybe you pray. But in the back of your mind, you're always wondering, is that tickle in my throat the beginning of the end? Even animals weren't safe. Dogs, cats, cattle, all dropped dead with no warning. People thought the world was ending. And honestly, it kind of was. Population collapse meant fewer workers. Entire farms were abandoned. Markets emptied out. Churches couldn't even bury all the bodies. In many places, carts rolled down the streets full of corpses, with people shouting, "Bring out your dead," like it was some kind of horrible routine. Now you might think the plague came and went, but it didn't. The Black Death kept returning in waves for centuries. It never really went away. Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia were hit, again and again, each time reshaping society, wiping out generations and rewriting the rules of survival. One thing it did do, unintentionally, was shift the balance of power. With so many people gone, labour became more valuable. Peasants started demanding higher wages. In some areas, the rigid feudal system started to crack. It was a silver lining, but you had to survive the disease first. Which most didn't. We've actually found mass graves from this period. Pits full of stacked bones, rushed burials, and sometimes entire families buried together. There was no time for ceremony. Just dig, drop, repeat. And yet even in the middle of this chaos, people found ways to hold on to hope. Some wrote journals. Others painted or carved little figures to protect them. People still fell in love. Still lit candles. Still tried to hold on to something human, even when everything around them was falling apart. The psychological impact? Huge. Europe became obsessed with death. Skeletons started showing up in art, dancing with the living. Songs were written about the plague. Stories passed down about neighbours turning on each other or saving each other. Trauma echoed for generations. And even now, centuries later, we still remember that time when rats and fleas held the fate of millions in their tiny little paws. So if you've ever had a bad flu and thought, this is the worst, just remember, at least you weren't coughing up blood in a medieval village, while your neighbours burned herbs and screamed prayers into the night. You're already winning. Next up though, we're going even further back in time. Before cities, before plagues, before rats even had jobs. We're going straight into the frozen heart of the Ice Age. A time when just staying warm was a heroic act. Okay, now imagine waking up and your blanket is made of animal skin, your roof is made of branches, and every time you breathe your nose freezes a little. Welcome to the Ice Age, a time when being human meant fighting for survival. Every single day around 20,000 years ago, massive sheets of ice covered huge parts of the Earth, and unless you were lucky enough to live near the equator, life was basically a daily test of how not to freeze to death. This wasn't just a chilly winter, this was full-on nature's deep freezer. The temperature could drop so low that rivers turned to solid ice, and animals migrated or died. And guess what? Humans didn't have central heating or jackets with zippers. Your coat was literally whatever you could hunt. And skin that week. Most people lived in small groups, maybe 20 to 50 people, and survival meant teamwork. You needed someone to watch the fire, someone to track animals, someone to keep wolves from eating the kids, and someone to rub sticks together until sparks happened. There was no Wi-Fi, no cereal, no weather app to tell you snow was coming. You just looked at the sky and hoped you wouldn't get buried alive in your own shelter. Food was always a problem. You hunted mammoths, reindeer, maybe bison, and if you were lucky, you'd get one big enough to feed your group for weeks, but hunting was dangerous. Mammoths weren't just big, they were fast and angry. And your weapons were sharp rocks tied to sticks, not exactly high-tech. If hunting failed, you'd turn to berries, nuts or roots, but during the coldest times, even plants disappeared and people had to survive on dried meat, frozen fat, or nothing at all. Sometimes even chewing on old bones just to feel full for a minute. And sleeping wasn't cosy either. No pillows, no blankets, just furs and fire, and the constant sound of the wind howling through your cave, or tent. Every little task took energy and time. If you wanted water, you melted snow. If you wanted firewood, you chopped it with stone tools. And if you got sick, there were no doctors or medicine, just hope and maybe some herbs that might help. And yet people survived somehow. They found ways to keep going. To laugh, to paint animals on cave walls, maybe even to fall in love. If you were lucky enough to grow up, you'd learn how to track animals, how to tell when a storm was coming, and how to stitch furs together with bone needles. By the time you were 30, you'd be considered an elder, which sounds cool until you realise it mostly meant your joints hurt and your teeth were falling out. But even with all that cold, hunger and danger, there was something kind of amazing about how humans adapted. We learned to make better tools, to build stronger shelters, and to follow the herds across frozen plains like ancient snow nomads. We didn't have written history back then, so most of what we know comes from bones tools and cave paintings left behind by people who lived in a world colder and harsher than anything we can imagine today. And when the Ice Age started to end around 12,000 years ago, people slowly began to settle in warmer places, grow food and build the first villages. But during the worst of it, life was about survival. Not comfort, not goals, not dreams, just getting through one more night without freezing or starving. And if you've ever felt cold, waiting for the bus, just remember, at least you didn't have to chase a mammoth through a snowstorm with a rock tied to a stick, because that was real, and it was rough. But somehow we made it through. And next we're going to talk about a whole different kind of pain. One that didn't come from nature, but from other people. Welcome to the world of ancient slavery where glory came with a price, and it was paid by the broken backs of others. Alright, so imagine waking up before sunrise every single day, and instead of deciding what cereal to eat, you're dragged outside, chained to a group of strangers. and forced to haul giant stones across the desert or dig trenches until your hands bleed. Welcome to the world of ancient slavery, where entire cities, temples and wonders of the world were built on the backs of people who never had a choice. Slavery has existed in almost every civilization, from ancient Egypt to Greece to Rome and even far beyond that. And for the people who lived it, life wasn't just hard, it was hopeless. You weren't a person. You were property. Maybe you were born into it. Maybe you were captured during a war, or maybe your family sold you because they were starving. Either way, once you were labelled a slave, your life was no longer yours. Your job was whatever your owner wanted it to be, and you had no rights. No pay and no way out. Some slaves worked in fields or kitchens. Others were forced into mines where they breathed in dust and poison. Every day until their lungs gave out, and some were chained to war galleys rowing for hours, without rest, knowing that if they slowed down they'd get whipped, or worse in places like ancient Rome. Some slaves worked as teachers or scribes, but even then they could be beaten, sold or killed on a whim, and others were used for entertainment, made to fight in arenas, where people cheered as they bled out in the sand. Imagine being forced to fight another human with a sword, just to survive the day, and if you didn't win, you didn't go home. You went into the ground. There were moments when things got especially dark, for example. The building of the Great Pyramids often gets romanticised, but behind the scenes, it was a brutal job involving thousands of workers under intense heat dragging blocks the size of trucks across the desert. And even though some say not all of them were slaves, many absolutely were. And they didn't get history books written about them. They got dust and pain in ancient Greece. Slaves could be bought at markets like livestock. And if you were disobedient, you could be branded with a hot iron in ancient China during massive construction projects. Like the Great Wall, people were forced to work for years, under freezing or burning conditions, and if they died, they were sometimes just buried in the wall itself. And what made it worse was how normal it was. Slavery wasn't a crime, it was part of life. It was built into the economy, the culture, the way people thought about the world. And even if you somehow gained your freedom, you could never escape what you'd been through. The scars, the trauma, the memories stuck with you forever. Most slaves never even made it that far, because their bodies gave out. First, they didn't live to old age, they didn't get rest, they didn't get peace. And that's something we have to remember when we look back at all the ancient wonders. We admire the marble temples, the great statues, the epic cities. They weren't made by magic. They were made by human hands under chains, under whips, under fear. And the people who did the work are mostly forgotten. Their names lost their lives, erased, and yet their suffering built the foundations of empires. So the next time you hear someone say they wish they could go back to ancient times, just remind them that unless they were royalty or super rich, they'd probably be hauling bricks in the sun, hoping to survive long enough to eat a crust of bread. And now that we've seen what humans can do to each other, let's take a look at what happens when entire civilizations start to fall apart. When the systems break down, when safety vanishes and the world starts eating itself. Welcome to the next chapter, where collapse means chaos and no one is safe. So let's say somehow you weren't born during a plague or chained up in a mine, and instead you live in a peaceful little city with markets, fresh breadwater from stone pipes, and maybe even some form of government that actually functions things, feels stable, safe, like the world finally figured itself out. And then suddenly it all starts to fall apart, not with one big crash, but with a slow, painful unravelling. Welcome to the collapse of civilization. And if you think things are bad now, just be glad you weren't around when entire empires crumbled into dust. Let's start with the Bronze Age collapse, around 1200 BCE, a time when some of the most advanced societies in the world, like the Hittites, the Mycenaeans and the ancient Egyptians, just started falling like dominoes. We still don't fully understand why, but it seems like a mix of climate change, drought invasions, earthquakes and internal chaos. Basically a buffet of disaster trade networks vanished. Cities burned down. Writing systems were forgotten, and people were left in the ruins, wondering what happened if you were a merchant. One day you were selling pottery across the sea, and the next you were hiding in the hills, hoping raiders didn't torch your village. The fall of Rome is another classic example. By the time the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 400s, life in many areas went from urban convenience to survival mode. Overnight aqueducts stopped working, roads broke down, armies disappeared, and local warlords took over instead of emperors. If you were a Roman citizen, used to bathhouses and bread distribution, you suddenly found yourself hunting rats in your backyard and hoping your neighbour didn't turn into a bandit. And even when civilizations didn't fall in one big moment, they could still crumble slowly. The Mayan civilization, which once had advanced astronomy, math and towering pyramids, began declining for reasons that included drought, famine and warfare, and eventually huge cities were swallowed by the jungle, and people just scattered. If you were there during that time, you'd see your community shrink. The temples close, the crops fail, and no one able to explain why. And then there's the psychological side. Imagine knowing your way of life is ending, but not understanding how or what comes next. You can't just hop online or move to another country. There is no backup plan when your civilization collapses. You lose everything. Not just your home and food, but your culture, your identity, your sense of the future. And people didn't go quietly, they fought. They fled, they looted. And in many cases they turned on each other. You might be a farmer who suddenly has to become a soldier, or a priest who's now begging for food in a burned out village. And every day you wake up wondering what will go wrong next. Maybe the water's gone. Maybe the crops are dying. Maybe another tribe is headed your way with torches and spears. And you don't even know who they are, but you know they're hungry too. Collapse isn't just about buildings falling. It's about trust breaking down when you stop believing your leaders can protect you, or that your community can survive together. Panic takes over, and when panic spreads faster than food or hope, that's when it really gets ugly. Sometimes people tried to hold things together. They built walls, started over, made desperate deals. But most of the time it was too late. The systems were too broken, the damage too deep. And eventually all that's left is ruins, bones and a few forgotten names scratched into stone. So while we talk a lot about the rise of civilizations, the truth is most of them fall. And if you happen to be alive during one of those endings, it was one of the worst times you could have ever been human. Because it wasn't just a disaster, it was the death of your whole world. And next we're going to zoom in on one of those broken societies and walk through a typical day in a medieval village where your problems are less about falling empires and more about surviving toothaches, wars and soup made of sadness. Alright, so you've made it through collapsing empires now. Let's drop into a regular medieval village, somewhere in Europe around the year 1300. And spoiler alert, it's not exactly a dream vacation. The first thing you'll notice is the smell, because there's no plumbing, no trash pickup, and everyone just kind of dumps their waste. Wherever there's room, people share houses with animals. Floors are dirt and bathing's rare. Not because they're lazy, but because clean water is hard to come by. And warm water is basically a luxury. If you're lucky, you live in a one-room hut with a fire pit in the middle and a hay mattress that may or may not have bugs in it. You wake up with the sun and start working immediately. Maybe you're a farmer, planting in rocky soil with wooden tools, or maybe you're a blacksmith or a baker or a shepherd. Either way, your job is hard, and the pay is usually nothing, because most people are peasants working land they don't own. You owe everything to the local lord who takes a big chunk of your harvest as rent, and in return you get the privilege of not being kicked off the land. Feudalism is the name of the game, and it means you are basically stuck in your role for life. If your parents were peasants, you're a peasant. If your dad made horseshoes, so will you, and forget about social climbing. The only ladder here is the one you use to clean the chimney when winter hits. Things get worse, your food stores run low. And if the harvest was bad, you might go days without eating anything. But stale bread or boiled weeds. Diseases everywhere because nobody understands germs and people toss their waste into the streets. Rats love it, and so do fleas, which is how the plague spreads when it shows up. But even without plague, you've still got dysentery, typhoid-infected wounds, and no real doctors, just herbal remedies and prayers. If you get a toothache, you're either pulling it yourself or waiting until it falls out on its own. Childbirth is dangerous for women, and infant death is common. Most people die young, maybe in their 30s or 40s. And if you make it past that, you're considered old now. Throw in the occasional war because knights and kings are always fighting over land. And when they pass through your village, they're not shy about taking your grain, your livestock, and maybe your house too. And if you try to protest, there's a decent chance you'll be punished, or just ignored. There's also religion. Everywhere. Churches, bells, priests telling you to repent because pretty much everything is considered a sin. People fear hell and hope for heaven. Because honestly, this life isn't offering much, and every once in a while, Someone is accused of being a witch or consorting with demons, and they get dragged out and punished, sometimes publicly. And most people just watch because that's what everyone does. Fun is rare, but it exists. People sing, dance during festivals, drink ale, play games, tell stories around fires. But those are tiny breaks between years of work, hunger, and fear. If you're a kid, you don't get a childhood. You start helping your family as soon as you can walk. Maybe you herd goats or sweep the floor or help carry water. And school isn't really a thing. Unless you're rich or training to be a monk, most people can't read or write. And news travels slow and full of rumours. The world feels small and scary, and every day is about making it to the next one somehow. And yet people still fall in love, raise families, make jokes, carve little symbols into wooden walls, and dream about better lives. And that's the thing about being human. No matter how rough it gets, people find a way to keep going, but there's no sugarcoating it. Life in a medieval village was tough, dirty, and exhausting. And next we're going to talk about what happens when strangers show up from across the sea and say they've discovered something new, when really they're about to bring disease, slavery, and centuries of pain. Welcome to the age of colonization. And for a lot of people, it was the worst time to be human ever recorded. Now imagine you live in a peaceful village, maybe somewhere in the Americas, or Africa, or the islands of the Pacific. You know, your land, your people, your traditions, you hunt fish, grow food, raise your kids, and tell stories around the fire. Your world has its problems, sure, but it's yours. And then one day, strange ships appear on the horizon full of people wearing metal clothes, holding flags and speaking in a language you've never heard. They smile at first, offer gifts, maybe even try to trade, but it doesn't take long before things start to change. And not in a good way. They bring diseases your people have never seen and can't fight off: smallpox, measles, influenza. And it spreads like wildfire through your village before you even understand what's happening. Entire communities are dying within weeks. Some places lost up to 90% of their population without a single battle, just from disease alone. And for those who survive, it only gets worse, because soon the visitors want your land, your gold, your resources, and if you don't give it to them, they'll take it by force. Colonization wasn't just about maps and ships. It was about domination, erasing cultures, enslaving people, and rewriting history with someone else's pen. You might be captured, chained and shipped across an ocean to work in fields or mines in places you've never seen, or forced to convert to a new religion and abandon your language, your customs, your name. Some people tried to resist, some fought back hard, but the invaders had guns, cannons, armour, and a whole lot of greed. If you were caught resisting, the punishments were brutal public executions, torture villages burned to the ground, and the message was always clear: obey or disappear, even if you weren't enslaved. Life under colonization was full of fear. You could be taxed for land. Your family had lived on for generations, banned from practicing your own beliefs, or forced into schools that taught you to be ashamed of who you were. It wasn't just physical control. It was psychological. People were told they were inferior savages, backwards, less than human. And that damage lasted for centuries, and still echoes today. And what makes it worse is how often the colonizers called it progress, or civilization, or discovery. Like they were doing you a favour by tearing your world apart. Entire cultures were wiped out, languages lost forever, sacred places destroyed, and stories erased before they could even be written down. And yet even through all that, people still found ways to survive, to hold on to pieces of their identity, to pass down songs, dances, food names, anything they could hide or protect. Some rebelled in secret, some escaped into the mountains or forests. Some blended old traditions into new ones and kept their spirit alive even when everything else was taken from them. So if you ever hear someone romanticize the age of exploration, remind them that for millions of people, it was the start of a nightmare, not an adventure. And being human during those first contacts, especially if you were on the wrong end of a musket, was one of the most dangerous, heartbreaking, and hopeless times in history. And now we're moving into another brutal era, one that looks more modern but is still full of suffering. It's loud, smoky, crowded, and it smells like coal. Welcome to the Industrial Revolution, where machines are everywhere and safety is nowhere. Alright, now you've made it past plagues and empires and wars, and you'd think by now life would be getting a little better. But welcome to the Industrial Revolution, where the future shows up, wrapped in coal smoke factory, whistles and 10-hour shifts with no lunch breaks. This is the late 1700s through the 1800s, and while the world is inventing steam engines, light bulbs and machines that can do amazing things, it's also inventing a brand new kind of misery for the average person. If you're poor, and most people are, you live in a crowded city, apartment that smells like sewage, with no running water, no heating, and maybe 6 other people in one room. Your job is in a factory where the noise never stops. The air is full of dust and chemicals, and you work from sunup to sundown, 6 or 7 days a week. If you're late or too tired, you get fired, and there's always someone else desperate to take your place. If you're a child too bad because you're working too, maybe in a textile mill with sharp gears, or in a coal mine where the tunnels are too small for adults, but just right for little kids. People lost fingers, hands, eyes, entire lives to machines that never slowed down. And there were no safety rules, no insurance, no sick days. If you got injured, you were lucky to crawl home and hope your family could still afford bread. People died young and hard, sometimes just collapsing on the factory floor. And nobody blinked an eye, and the streets weren't any better. Cities grew so fast they couldn't keep up with basic needs. Garbage piled up, water got contaminated, and diseases like cholera spread fast. Entire neighbourhoods became giant slums full of hungry, tired, coughing people who still had to show up for work every morning and try not to get crushed by gears or poisoned by fumes. And if you thought country life was easier, think again, farm work was still brutal, and now machines were replacing workers, so people were getting pushed off land. They'd lived on for generations and forced into cities to start all over again. Even women who were supposed to stay at home according to the times were pulled into factories because families couldn't survive on one paycheck. And they got paid less than men and treated just as badly. And the worst part is all this suffering was considered normal. People thought this was progress, the cost of civilization, the price of the future. And sure, we got trains, electricity, and some cool science, but regular people paid with their bodies and their lives, and almost nobody cared as long as the machines kept running and the money kept flowing. And you couldn't really complain because there were no unions yet, no workers' rights movements. Not until years of pain and protest finally forced laws to be made, but by then so many people had already been buried under bricks, coal or silence. And that's what makes this time so brutal. It looked like a better world on the outside, but underneath it was still just survival in a different costume. And now we're heading into the most explosive chapter of all, the one where 2 world wars shook the earth to its core, and humanity came face to face with its own destruction. Welcome to the final chapter, the century of fire and fear. So here we are, the final stretch of our long tour through human misery, and now we've entered the 1900s, a time full of inventions, hope, progress, and then almost immediately, 2 of the deadliest wars the planet has ever seen. First up is World War I, where millions of soldiers were tossed into muddy trenches across Europe with rats, rain and artillery shells for company. Imagine waking up knee-deep in cold mud, hearing gunfire in the distance, knowing today could be the day a shell drops on your head, or you breathe in poison gas and never get up again. It was called the war to end all wars, but instead it just set the stage for an even bigger one. World War II, which came with tanks, planes, bombs, concentration camps, and the horror of nuclear weapons cities were flattened in hours. People were rounded up and killed by the millions. Entire generations lost their youth to uniforms. Battlefields and fear civilians weren't safe either. Bombs fell on neighbourhoods. Children grew up without parents and hunger spread faster than hope. And then just when it seemed like it couldn't get worse, we dropped atomic bombs that wiped out cities in seconds and changed warfare forever. People melted, shadows burned into walls. Nothing like it had ever happened before. And the world knew it could happen again after that. Came the Cold War, decades of paranoia and the constant low-level fear that someone somewhere might press a button and start the end of the world. People built bunkers. Schools held drills where kids hid under desks like that would help. And even though the bombs never dropped, the fear was always there, buzzing in the background. And throughout all of this, smaller wars popped up in places like Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East and Africa, with millions more lives caught in the crossfire. Every generation had its war, its wounds, and its reasons to cry. And in between the wars there were dictators, famines, genocides, and new kinds of pain we hadn't seen before, from chemical weapons to death camps to drone strikes. The 20th century was a masterclass in how far humans could push suffering. And the thing is, even when soldiers came home, the war didn't really end. It lived on in their minds, their nightmares, their silence, and their missing limbs. And yet, even through all of it, people still got married, had kids, wrote music, planted trees, and kept going like we always do. Because that's what humans are good at. Suffering, yes, but also surviving. Adapting. Rebuilding. Finding small joys in the middle of big disasters. And now here you are, safe in your bed, listening to this. Hopefully not too depressed. Maybe even a little more grateful for the time you live in. Because yes, the world today has problems, but at least you don't wake up to machine gun fire. Or worry that a plague rat is hiding under your floorboards. Or that your city will get swallowed by ice or ash. And that's kind of the point of this whole video. It's not to scare you or make you sad, it's just to remind you that we've come a long way. We've crawled through some of the darkest times in history, and somehow made it here. So if nothing else, maybe tonight you can fall asleep knowing that you are not living through the worst time to be human, because that time already happened, and we survived it. Thanks for staying with me through all that history. It wasn't exactly cheerful, but it was real. And maybe knowing what others lived through makes today feel a little lighter. You're here, you're warm, you're not chasing mammoths or hiding from plague doctors. And that's something to be grateful for, if you truly enjoyed this video. And these quiet storytelling nights, feel free to like and subscribe. Only if it honestly brings you peace. No pressure. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next story.